The accession of Alexander Severus in 222 CE marked a decisive turning point in the history of the Severan dynasty, coming immediately after the scandalous and chaotic reign of Elagabalus. Alexander was hailed by many as a savior young, virtuous, and malleable enough to be shaped into the kind of emperor Rome desperately needed. His rise to power was not merely the accident of dynastic succession, but the result of careful maneuvering by his grandmother Julia Mamaea. To understand Alexander's early years as emperor and cultural context in which his reign began, a time of disillusionment, relief, and cautious hope for the restoration of Roman traditions. Alexander Severus was born Marcus Julius Gessius Passianus Alexianus on October 1, 208 CE, in Arca Caesarea, a small town in the Roman province of Syria Finis. He was the son of Julia Mamaea, herself a daughter of Julia Mamaea. Like his cousin Elagabalus, Alexander, whose fortunes were intertwined with those of the Severan dynasty established by Septimius Severus in 193 CE. His upbringing was carefully supervised by Julia Mamaea. Unlike Elagabalus, who was raised in the religiously charged atmosphere of Amasis temple of the sun god, Alexander was given a more traditional Roman education. From an early age, he was presented not as a priest or exotic figure, but as a serious. The turning point in Alexander's fortunes came during the reign of Elagabalus, began to promote him as an alternative to her increasingly unpopular grandson. Elagabalus himself, aware of Alexander's rising popularity, nevertheless, Julia Mamaea skillfully maneuvered behind the scenes to protect Alexander and cultivate his image among the Praetorian Guard and the Senate. By the year 221 CE, Elagabalus had been forced. This act, intended to stabilize the dynasty, ironically sealed Elagabalus's fate, as the adoption only intensified the contrast between the erratic emperor and his calm, disciplined cousin. When Elagabalus was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard in March 222 CE, Alexander was immediately proclaimed emperor. He was only 13 years old, making him one of the youngest emperors in Roman history. His accession was greeted with jubilation in Rome. The Senate, humiliated by the eccentricities of Elagabalus, embraced Alexander with enthusiasm, showering him with honors and titles. The people, weary of scandal and religious innovations, welcomed a return to stability. The army, particularly the Praetorian Guard, viewed Alexander as a safer and more respectable figure to rally around. For Julia Mamaea and Julia Mamaea, the transition represented a triumph of dynastic politics. They had successfully replaced one grandson with another. The first years of Alexander's reign were dominated by the influence of his mother and grandmother. Julia Mamaea, though elderly, continued to exercise enormous power until her death in 224 CE. Julia Mamaea, however, quickly emerged as the central figure in her son's administration, and to that end she surrounded him with a circle of advisors drawn from the senatorial class. Foremost among these was the distinguished jurist Ulpian, one of the greatest legal minds of the age, whom she appointed as prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Ulpian and others like him were tasked with guiding the young emperor. This reliance on senatorial advisors marked a significant shift from the preceding reign. Whereas Elagabalus had alienated the Senate through his contempt for its traditions, he regularly consulted the Senate, restored many of its privileges, and presented himself as a humble and dutiful princeps rather than an absolute monarch. Coins minted during this period bore legends emphasizing virtues such as pietas, virtues, and clementia, reinforcing the image of a ruler devoted to the welfare of the Roman state. This careful crafting of imperial image was essential, as Alexander was still a teenager and thus lacked the authority to dominate the political scene independently. His mother and advisors used propaganda, ritual, and policy to present him as the ideal emperor in training. The excesses of Elagabalus, particularly his attempts to impose the worship of the Syrian sun god upon Rome, had created deep resentment. Alexander, guided by his mother and advisors, reversed these policies. He restored the traditional gods to their rightful places of honor and reaffirmed Rome's commitment to its ancestral cults. Ancient sources suggest that he kept a shrine in his private residence that contained not only images of Roman gods, but also of Abraham, Christ, Orpheus, and other figures associated with diverse religious traditions. Though it is difficult to know how much of this reflects historical reality, and how much represents later attempts to portray him as a model of tolerance. Alexander's domestic policies during his first years emphasized stability and good governance. With Ulpian as his chief advisor, legal reforms were undertaken to strengthen the administration of justice. The emperor was portrayed as accessible and responsive to petitions. Taxation was administered with greater fairness than under his predecessors. Julia Mamaea insisted that her son avoid the trappings of luxury and instead focus on the responsibilities of his office. Alexander was expected to live modestly, yet beneath the surface of this apparent harmony lay tensions that would shape the course of his reign. Julia Mamaea's dominance of her son's administration was resented by many officers, who saw her as meddlesome and overbearing. The Praetorian Guard, in particular, chafed under the authority of Ulpian, whose legalistic approach to discipline clashed with their traditions. In 223 CE, these tensions exploded into violence when Ulpian was murdered by the Guard, possibly in the presence of the emperor himself. This event revealed the limits of Alexander's authority and underscored the precarious balance between senatorial ideals and military realities. His youth, combined with his apparent humility and devotion to Rome's traditions, made him an appealing figure. Writers like Herodian described him as gentle, dutiful, and respectful, a sharp contrast to the wild excesses of Elagabalus. To the Senate and people of Rome, he represented a restoration of dignity to the imperial office. To the army, he remained an untested but acceptable leader. This combination of youth, virtue, and relative peace characterized the first years of his reign. Nevertheless, the seeds of future difficulties were already sown. His attempts to reconcile the Senate with the army often left both dissatisfied. His cautious personality, shaped by Mamaea's strict guidance. For the moment, however, these issues were overshadowed by relief at the end of Elagabalus's reign and optimism for a brighter future under Alexander Severus. Thus, the first years of Alexander's reign can be understood as a period of restoration and careful consolidation. Under the watchful eye of Julia Mamaea and the guidance of advisors like Ulpian, the young emperor sought to heal the wounds inflicted by his predecessor, restore confidence in the imperial office. Whether he would succeed in carrying these qualities into the harsher tests of military conflict remained to be seen. But for now, Rome allowed itself to hope that the boy emperor might grow into a man worthy of the burden he had inherited. When Alexander Severus officially assumed power in 222 CE, following the violent death of Elagabalus, the Roman Empire entered a new chapter defined by restraint, reform, and the guiding influence of his mother, Julia Mamaea. Unlike his predecessor, who had antagonized the Senate and alienated the military, Alexander Severus sought to restore stability by cooperating with the political elite and reducing unnecessary extravagance. His reign began with the promise of peace and order, qualities that were desperately needed after the chaos of Elagabalus. One of the most immediate challenges facing the young emperor was winning the support of the Roman Senate. Elagabalus had left the Senate humiliated and mistrustful of imperial authority. To heal this division, Alexander made careful moves to reinstate the Senate's dignity, granting them respect in public ceremonies and involving them more often in decision-making. Ancient sources such as Herodian note that senators were relieved to see a ruler who valued their role. This approach earned Alexander goodwill early in his reign, as many senators felt they were finally free from the arbitrary humiliations inflicted by the previous emperor. Religion was another area where Alexander diverged sharply from Elagabalus. Instead of forcing Rome to adopt the Eastern cult of Elagabal, Alexander promoted a policy of tolerance. He supported the traditional Roman gods, restored temples that had been neglected, and allowed various religions to coexist. Some accounts suggest that Alexander even admired aspects of Christianity, which was still an underground movement at the time. For example, it is said that he kept a shrine in his private quarters where images of Abraham, Jesus, and other revered figures stood alongside traditional Roman deities. This inclusiveness gave him a reputation as a more open-minded and tolerant emperor, one who sought harmony rather than religious conflict. Alexander's reign also brought about economic reforms. The empire had suffered under the reckless spending and extravagance of his cousin Elagabalus, so Alexander and his advisors set out to stabilize finances. Taxes were moderated, and he paid special attention to ensuring fair treatment of the provinces. He discouraged corruption among governors by enforcing stricter laws, punishing those found guilty of extortion. The emperor's careful financial policies allowed Rome to regain some measure of economic stability, though ongoing wars and military expenses still placed a heavy burden on the treasury. Julia Mamaea, Alexander's mother, played a decisive role in shaping his policies. Many ancient historians describe her as a dominating figure who essentially co-ruled with her son. Though Alexander was the emperor, Julia Mamaea ensured that his decisions reflected wisdom and caution. She gathered a council of jurists, philosophers, and military advisors who guided Alexander in governance. This system of rule, heavily reliant on advice from experienced statesmen, was both a strength and a weakness. On the one hand, it prevented reckless decisions. On the other, it created the perception that Alexander was too dependent on his mother, undermining his authority in the eyes of the army and more traditional Romans who expected the emperor to embody strength and independence. During these early years, Alexander's reign was remarkably peaceful compared to the instability of previous decades. Trade routes functioned without significant interruption. Cities thrived under fairer governance, and Roman citizens began to believe that stability had finally returned. His focus on justice and moderation was welcomed by many, and his reputation as a gentle and just emperor began to grow. However, beneath this surface of peace, threats to the empire were already brewing. Along the northern frontiers, Germanic tribes were testing Rome's defenses, while in the east, the powerful Sassanid Persians were becoming a formidable rival. These external challenges would soon dominate Alexander's reign, forcing him to prove whether he could be more than just a cautious ruler guided by advisors. For now, though, the empire rested in a period of recovery. Alexander Severus appeared to embody a hopeful balance: respect for tradition, tolerance of diversity, and a focus on good governance. Rome was momentarily reassured, but the peace of these early years was fragile, dependent on both the emperor's wisdom and the empire's ability to confront the storms that were gathering on its borders. As Alexander Severus matured into his reign, the empire's fragile peace was increasingly tested by external threats. The greatest of these challenges came from the east, where a new and vigorous power was rising: the Sassanid Empire of Persia. Unlike the weakened Parthians, who had been Rome's rivals for centuries but were often unstable, the Sassanids represented a rejuvenated, aggressive force determined to reclaim lands once held by the Achaemenid Persians and to assert dominance over the eastern regions. Around 230 CE, the Sassanid king Ardashir I launched campaigns into Roman territories, striking deep into Mesopotamia and threatening Syria. This was no minor raid, but a full-scale invasion, one that exposed Rome's vulnerability. The news of Persian armies advancing through the east spread quickly, unsettling both the population and the Roman Senate. For Alexander Severus, this was his first true test as emperor. Would he prove himself capable of leading the legions and defending the empire? Or would he be seen as weak and overly dependent on advisors? Alexander, under the guidance of his mother Julia Mamaea and his council, decided to personally lead the military campaign in the east. This decision was symbolic, meant to show the Roman army and people that the emperor was not just a figure of ceremony, but willing to face danger alongside his soldiers. He marched eastward with a large force, though ancient sources debate the exact size of his army. Regardless, it was one of the most significant mobilizations of his reign. When Alexander arrived in Antioch, he established the city as his base of operations. His approach to the Persian threat reflected his cautious nature. Instead of rushing into battle, he listened to his generals and planned a three-pronged strategy. The Roman army would be divided into three groups: one to advance through Mesopotamia, another to move through Armenia, and a third to defend Syria. In theory, this plan would pressure the Persians on multiple fronts and protect Rome's vulnerable provinces. However, the reality was less successful. The Roman forces advancing into Mesopotamia encountered harsh conditions, supply shortages, and fierce Persian resistance. Many soldiers perished not only in combat, but also due to disease and the unforgiving climate. Another wing of the army fared better in Armenia, where they were able to secure alliances and hold the frontier. But overall, the campaign did not achieve a decisive victory. The Persians remained a formidable enemy, and Rome's military prestige was damaged by the perception that Alexander's strategy had been overly cautious and poorly executed. Despite the mixed results, Alexander attempted to portray the campaign as a success. Coins were minted celebrating victories, and official reports emphasized Rome's resilience in defending its borders. To the Senate and the Roman people, Alexander sought to project confidence, but among the legions, doubts began to grow. Many soldiers viewed the emperor as hesitant and too reliant on advisors rather than demonstrating bold leadership on the battlefield. This would have long-term consequences for his relationship with the army. While the eastern frontier remained tense, trouble was also stirring in the north. Germanic tribes, particularly the Alemanni, were becoming increasingly aggressive along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Their raids disrupted trade, threatened Roman settlements, and demanded the emperor's immediate attention. By the early 230s, Alexander was forced to shift focus from the east to the north, preparing for a campaign against the Germanic invaders. The challenges of managing both eastern and northern threats revealed the difficult position of Rome during Alexander's reign. The empire's borders stretched vast distances, and enemies were pressing from multiple directions. Alexander's cautious style of rule, while effective in civil governance, was tested under the relentless pressure of military conflict. The legions demanded decisive victories and bold leadership qualities. They admired in emperors like Septimius Severus and Caracalla. Unfortunately, Alexander's tendency to deliberate and consult widely before acting was often perceived as weakness. Yet, during this period, Alexander still retained the loyalty of the Senate and many citizens of Rome. His reign was marked by justice, relative tolerance, and fairness, qualities that contrasted sharply with the brutality of some of his predecessors. The real question was whether such virtues could sustain him in a world where military strength often determined survival. By the mid-230s, the stage was set for Alexander Severus's greatest trial, the Germanic campaigns. It was here, along the northern frontier, that his relationship with the army would ultimately unravel and seal his fate. The latter years of Alexander Severus's then brought him face to face with the greatest test of his rule and the most decisive events that would determine his legacy. After years of relative calm and careful governance, the empire was now forced to contend with a rising tide of external threats. The Sassanid Wars had shaken Rome's sense of security, though Alexander and his advisors tried to frame the Persian campaign as a defensive success. There was little doubt among the soldiers and commanders that it had ended inconclusively at best. Military prestige was the cornerstone of Roman authority. For Alexander, who was known more for his cautious diplomacy and the influence of his mother Julia Mamaea than for martial valor, The looming Germanic crisis along the Rhine frontier would be the true crucible of his rule. The northern frontier of the empire had always been a source of tension. Raiding settlements in the early 230s, reports reached Rome that the Alemanni and other Germanic groups were crossing into Roman territory with increasing boldness. They threatened not only the security of the provinces, but also the pride of the Roman army, who had long viewed themselves as the guardians of civilization against the so-called barbarian menace. The Senate, alarmed by the incursions, urged Alexander to take decisive action. The legions stationed in the region also clamored for a strong imperial presence. Alexander, guided as always by his mother and his council of advisors, in 234 CE, he departed Rome for the Rhine frontier. Many in the army believed that an emperor should act independently. The perception that Alexander relied heavily on Julia Mamaea was a recurring criticism and would soon become a fatal weakness. When the emperor arrived on the Rhine, he encountered a dangerous situation. The Alemanni had penetrated deeply into Roman territory, and the morale of the frontier troops was low. Instead, Alexander's cautious nature led him to pursue a strategy of diplomacy. Rather than risk a pitched battle against the Alemanni, he sought to negotiate peace, offering payments and gifts in exchange for their withdrawal, sparing Roman lives and preserving resources at a time when the empire was already stretched thin. However, the soldiers interpreted this policy very differently. They had marched with their emperor, expecting victory and glory, but instead they were ordered to watch as gold was handed to the barbarians. The Alemanni accepted the gifts, but viewed the Roman gestures as a sign of weakness, emboldening them for future raids. Among the Roman soldiers, anger and resentment grew. The emperor who had failed to secure victory against the Persians was now seen as failing again. The army's discontent was compounded by other factors. Many officers and soldiers resented the influence of Julia Mamaea, whom they saw as meddling in matters of war that should have been left to generals. Ancient sources describe her as overbearing, controlling, and disdainful of the military ethos, more concerned with maintaining her own authority and wealth than with the needs of the legions. The perception that Alexander was ruled by his mother undermined his authority as a commander, for Roman soldiers valued strength, independence, and martial prowess above all else. To them, Alexander's rule seemed weak and compromised. Tensions reached a breaking point during the winter of 234 to 235 CE, when the army encamped near Mainz on the Rhine. The legions were restless, dissatisfied with their emperor's refusal to lead them into decisive battle. Rumors spread that other commanders could better serve Rome, men who would not hesitate to meet the Alemanni in open combat. One figure in particular began to attract attention: Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, a career soldier of Thracian origin who had risen through the ranks due to his immense physical strength and military talent. Known to history as Maximinus Thrax, he embodied the martial virtues the legions admired: boldness, toughness, and loyalty to his men. As the winter dragged on, resentment toward Alexander and Mamaea solidified into open hostility. The emperor attempted to maintain discipline and order, but the soldiers no longer respected his authority. His cautious diplomacy, once seen by the Senate as wisdom, was now viewed by the army as weakness and betrayal. The contrast between Alexander and Maximinus Thrax became stark. One was a young emperor tied to his mother's influence, hesitant and diplomatic. The other was a hardened soldier, one of their own, who shared their hardships and promised decisive action against Rome's enemies. The mutiny that followed was almost inevitable. In early 235 CE, the legions stationed along the Rhine openly revolted. They proclaimed Maximinus Thrax as emperor, raising him on a shield in the traditional manner of military acclamation. The soldiers abandoned Alexander Severus, whose attempts to rally their loyalty fell flat. He and Julia Mamaea withdrew to their tent, hoping to regain control of the situation through negotiation or appeals to reason. But the mutinous soldiers had already made their decision. The memory of gold handed to the Alemanni and the humiliation of missed victories could not be erased. The end came swiftly and brutally. The soldiers stormed Alexander's camp, and both he and his mother were murdered. Ancient accounts describe the scene as violent and merciless, with no attempt to spare the young emperor, despite his reputation for fairness and kindness. Julia Mamaea, whose dominance had defined his reign, shared his fate. Their deaths marked not only the fall of a ruler, but also the end of the Severan dynasty, which had begun with Septimius Severus decades earlier. The empire now passed into the hands of Maximinus Thrax, whose reign would usher in a new and turbulent era known as the crisis of the 3rd century. In reflecting on Alexander Severus's downfall, historians often emphasize the tension between his virtues as a civil administrator and his shortcomings as a military leader. He was, by all accounts, a just and moderate ruler, respectful of the Senate, tolerant of religious diversity, and attentive to the needs of his people. He sought to govern through reason, advice, and diplomacy rather than brute force. Yet, in the militarized world of the Roman Empire, where emperors were expected to lead victorious campaigns and inspire the legions, the army, the true arbiter of imperial power, demanded strength, decisiveness, and the ability to deliver victories on the battlefield. Alexander lost the loyalty of the very institution that sustained his throne. The Germanic campaign of 234 to 235 CE thus stands as the turning point of his reign, the moment when his cautious strategies collided with the uncompromising expectations of the legions. His attempt to buy peace with the Alemanni, while rational in terms of cost and risk, was catastrophic in terms of perception. The soldiers did not want peace purchased with gold. Alexander Severus's inability to reconcile these opposing demands sealed his fate. The tragedy of Alexander Severus lies in the disjunction between his intentions and his circumstances. But the world he inherited was not one that rewarded such virtues. It was an empire beset by external enemies and internal pressures, where military might and ruthless decisiveness were the currency of survival. His reliance on Julia Mamaea further complicated his image. In the end, Alexander Severus's downfall was not merely a personal failure, but a reflection of the broader challenges facing the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. His assassination by his own soldiers symbolized the shifting balance of power. The Senate's approval, the people's affection, and the emperor's personal virtues mattered little compared to the loyalty of the legions. The Severan dynasty, once so powerful under Septimius Severus, ended with a whimper, swept aside by the brutal realities of military politics. His reign, however, should not be dismissed as insignificant. For over a decade, Alexander Severus provided Rome with stability, justice, and relative peace. As a ruler who tried to govern for the benefit of the whole empire rather than for personal glory, his efforts to curb corruption and stabilize finances reflected a genuine concern for the prosperity of Rome's provinces. Even his cautious diplomacy, though ultimately his undoing, the story of Alexander Severus is thus both an inspiration and a warning. It shows the value of moderation, wisdom, and tolerance in leadership, but it also reveals the dangers of failing to meet the expectations of one's time. In an empire defined by its military power, his death in 235 CE marked the end of an era and the beginning of one of the most turbulent periods in Roman history, during which emperors would rise and fall with alarming rapidity, and the empire itself would be brought to the brink of collapse. The death of Alexander Severus in 235 CE sent shockwaves through the Roman Empire. For over a decade, his reign had represented a fragile balance of moderation, tolerance, and cautious governance. Now, with his murder at the hands of his own soldiers and the rise of Maximinus Thrax, Rome entered an age of unprecedented instability, known as the crisis of the 3rd century. The assassination of Alexander and Julia Mamaea did not merely mark the fall of a ruler. It signified the collapse of the Severan dynasty and the beginning of a half-century of near-constant upheaval. In the immediate aftermath, Alexander's legacy was colored by the circumstances of his death. To the soldiers who had killed him, he was remembered as weak, indecisive, and too dependent on his mother. His policy of negotiating with the Alemanni, rather than leading the army into decisive battle, was regarded as cowardice. An unforgivable failure in the eyes of legions who demanded victories and glory. This perception ensured that, in military circles, his name was tarnished. For generations of Roman soldiers, Alexander Severus served as a cautionary tale of what happened when an emperor lacked the martial spirit. Yet among senators and civilians, his reputation was much kinder. The Senate had long appreciated his respect for their authority. Unlike his cousin Elagabalus, who had humiliated and alienated them, Alexander had restored their dignity, listened to their counsel, and incorporated them into the process of governance. Many senators remembered him fondly as a just and reasonable ruler who sought to maintain Rome's traditions while introducing a spirit of fairness and moderation. Ancient writers such as Herodian emphasized his gentleness, contrasting his reign with the harshness of those who came after him. For ordinary Romans in the provinces, Alexander's reign had offered a decade of relative stability. He had curtailed corruption among governors, reduced excessive taxation, and attempted to protect the rights of provincial citizens. While external wars strained resources, his policies at home were marked by justice. His reputation as a tolerant ruler extended even to minority religions. Some traditions suggest that he regarded Christianity with a measure of respect, reportedly keeping an image of Christ among other revered figures in his private shrine. While historians debate the accuracy of this claim, the mere existence of such a story demonstrates how Alexander's reign was associated with openness and inclusivity, qualities rare in his age. A contrast between his domestic reputation and his military failures highlights the paradox of his rule. As a civil administrator, Alexander Severus was effective, moderate, and respected. But as a military leader, he failed to embody the decisiveness and strength demanded by Rome's armies. His assassination underscored the dangerous reality of the 3rd century, that the loyalty of the legions mattered more than the affection of the Senate or the people. No matter how just or capable a ruler was in civil affairs, without military support, he could not survive. The fall of Alexander Severus also marked the definitive end of the Severan dynasty. Beginning with Septimius Severus in 193 CE, the dynasty had overseen 4 decades of imperial rule, expanding Rome's frontiers and centralizing power in the emperor's hands. But the line had become plagued by instability and internal rivalries. From the fratricidal conflict between Caracalla and Geta, to the eccentric rule of Elagabalus, and finally to the cautious, dependent reign of Alexander. With Alexander's death, the dynasty ended abruptly, and the empire was thrust into an era where military generals, often proclaimed by their troops, would rise and fall in rapid succession. The accession of Maximinus Thrax immediately illustrated this new reality. A soldier emperor of humble origins, Maximinus represented the army's rejection of aristocratic, cautious rulers in favor of men who embodied brute strength and military daring. The Senate resented his rise, but they were powerless to oppose the will of the legions. This shift of power from the Senate and imperial family to the army signaled a profound transformation in the structure of Roman politics. The death of Alexander Severus was not only the fall of a man, but also the fall of a political order. In later centuries, historians and moralists often looked back on Alexander's reign with nostalgia. Compared to the chaos that followed, his time in power seemed like an age of peace and reason. Writers described him as a virtuous prince, a model of moderation who sought to govern justly. Some even portrayed him as a philosopher king, guided by wisdom and morality rather than ambition and cruelty. His reign became a symbol of what might have been possible had Rome been ruled by emperors more concerned with justice than with conquest. At the same time, his death served as a warning of the dangers of ignoring the expectations of the military. Rome in the 3rd century was a militarized empire, and emperors were expected to be generals first and administrators second. Alexander's reliance on diplomacy and his reluctance to risk open battle were virtues in peacetime, but vices in the eyes of soldiers accustomed to conquest. His attempt to buy peace with the Alemanni may have spared lives in the short term, but it destroyed his credibility with the legions. In this sense, his downfall was not merely a personal failure, but the result of structural contradictions within the empire itself. The broader legacy of Alexander Severus lies in the transition he represents. He was the last emperor of a dynasty, the last ruler of an age where imperial authority still rested on a balance of senate, family, and military. After his death, Rome plunged into the crisis of the 3rd century. A half-century of nearly continuous civil war, foreign invasions, economic collapse, and political fragmentation. The stability of Alexander's reign, though fragile and imperfect, stood in stark contrast to the chaos that followed. For this reason, later generations often idealized his rule as the final moment of calm before the storm. In conclusion, Alexander Severus was remembered as a ruler of paradoxes. To the Senate and the people, he was gentle, just, and fair. To the army, he was weak, indecisive, and unworthy of command. His reign embodied both the virtues of moderation and the dangers of failing to meet the brutal demands of military politics. His assassination was the inevitable outcome of these contradictions, and with it, the Severan dynasty came to a violent end. Though his rule may not have been marked by great victories or dramatic achievements, it stands as a poignant reminder of the delicate balance between civil governance and military power in the Roman Empire. His story is one of tragedy, for in seeking to govern with wisdom and justice, he fell victim to the uncompromising expectations of his time. Alexander Severus had reigned for over a decade. He was young, intelligent, and heavily influenced by his mother Julia Mamaea. Yet as time passed, the challenges facing his reign became increasingly overwhelming. The empire was no longer under threat from only internal intrigue, but from powerful enemies pressing at its borders. The Persians in the east and the Germanic tribes in the north presented dangers Rome had not encountered with such intensity for generations. The strain of defending the empire while trying to maintain domestic stability would eventually prove too much for the young emperor, and his failure to meet the expectations of his soldiers would become the key factor in his tragic downfall. The last years of his reign mark a turning point in Roman history. The first great challenge Alexander faced in his final years was in the east. The Persian Empire had undergone a transformation under the Sassanid dynasty. Ardashir I, the founder of this dynasty, was ambitious and determined to restore Persia's glory, looking upon Rome not as an untouchable power, but as a rival that could be challenged and defeated. Unlike the Parthians, who had been more fragmented and sometimes inconsistent in their military campaigns, the Sassanians were centralized, energetic, and militarily aggressive. Reports soon reached Rome that Ardashir had raided into Roman territory, for if Persia was allowed to expand unchecked, Rome's entire eastern frontier could collapse. Alexander knew he had to respond decisively. The campaign was not just about protecting Roman borders, it was about prestige. The Roman people expected their emperor to defend the empire's honor. Alexander, accompanied by his mother Julia Mamaea, led the imperial court to Antioch. The plan was to launch a three-pronged assault against Persia. One army advancing through Armenia in the north, another striking through central Mesopotamia, and a third moving south along the Tigris and Euphrates. This ambitious plan was meant to overwhelm the Persians and reassert Roman dominance. The Roman armies struggled with coordination, supply lines, and the harsh terrain of Mesopotamia. The Persian forces fought with skill and determination, making advances costly. While there were some victories, particularly in Armenia, where Roman allies were able to resist Persian control, the overall results were inconclusive. Worse, the Central Roman army suffered significant losses, for they had expected triumph and plunder, but found only hardship. By 233 CE, the campaign had largely stalled. In order to preserve face, the emperor presented the war as a victory. In a way, this was not entirely untrue. The Persians had not achieved their full objectives, and Rome had held onto its core territories. For the Roman army and the Roman people, this was unsatisfying. It highlighted one of the major weaknesses of Alexander's reign. He was a cautious ruler, more interested in compromise and negotiation than bold action. While this made him a capable administrator, it made him seem unworthy of leading Rome in a time of war. The legions, who respected emperors that shared their hardships and won victories through force, began to lose confidence in him. If the Persian campaign had weakened his reputation, the crisis in the north would utterly shatter it. Almost immediately after returning from the east, Alexander was forced to turn his attention to the Rhine and Danube frontiers. The Germanic tribes, emboldened by Rome's struggles, had begun launching major invasions into Roman territory. These were not small raids, but large-scale movements of warriors who threatened to devastate the provinces of Gaul. Cities were burned, farms destroyed. In 234 CE, Alexander and his mother traveled to Gaul to lead the response. Once again, the legions expected action. The soldiers, hardened by years of frontier service, wanted to march against the enemy and crush them in battle. But Alexander, guided by Julia Mamaea and his own temperament, preferred negotiation. He believed that bribing the tribes with gold to withdraw would be less costly than risking a pitched battle. To him, it was a pragmatic solution. Roman soldiers prided themselves on discipline, courage, and conquest. The tension between the emperor and his army grew unbearable. Alexander tried to maintain discipline and order, but the soldiers were angry and restless. They began to whisper that perhaps the empire needed a new leader, someone strong, someone who would fight as they expected. These whispers soon found their focus in a man named Maximinus Thrax, a towering figure of barbarian descent who had risen through the ranks of the army due to his immense strength and military skill. He embodied everything the soldiers admired: toughness, bravery, and experience in battle. The contrast between Maximinus and Alexander could not have been greater. By 235 CE, the discontent in the army reached its breaking point. In their camp at Mogontiacum, modern Mainz in Germany, the soldiers mutinied. They hailed Maximinus Thrax as emperor and turned against Alexander. Panic swept through the imperial court. Alexander and his mother Julia Mamaea attempted to restore order, but it was too late. The soldiers, enraged by years of frustration and by what they perceived as the emperor's weakness, stormed into his tent. Without hesitation, they murdered both Alexander Severus and his mother, ending his reign in a brutal and sudden fashion. The young emperor, who had tried to balance peace with pragmatism, the death of Alexander Severus marked more than just the fall of one emperor. It signaled the end of the Severan dynasty, which had ruled Rome since Septimius Severus had taken the throne in 193 CE. With his death, Rome lost the last traces of stability it had enjoyed under that dynasty. More importantly, it opened the door to an era of chaos that historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. From 235 CE onwards, the empire would endure 50 years of turmoil, during which dozens of emperors and usurpers would rise and fall. Economic collapse, plague, and disunity would nearly destroy the Roman state. Despite the tragedy of his end, Alexander Severus left behind a complex legacy. He was not a warrior, but he was a capable administrator. His religious policies, which respected multiple faiths, foreshadowed a more inclusive vision of Rome. Yet in a world dominated by the legions, these virtues were not enough. His reliance on his mother, his cautious diplomacy, and his failure to win glory in battle doomed him in the eyes of the army, for the Roman people, especially the soldiers. And so, Alexander Severus was remembered less for his reforms and more for his downfall. The soldiers who killed him believed they were ridding Rome of weakness, but in truth, they had destroyed the last thread of stability. His assassination unleashed a storm that would engulf the empire for half a century. In many ways, Alexander Severus was the last emperor of a fading world, the world of Pax Romana, when emperors could still balance civil governance with military leadership. After him, the empire became a battlefield. Alexander's story is therefore both inspiring and tragic. Inspiring because he tried to uphold the values of justice, fairness, and moderation in a time of growing darkness. His reign is a reminder of the delicate balance required to hold the Roman Empire together, and of how easily that balance could collapse when the expectations of the legions and the realities of governance diverged. The young emperor who sought peace instead of war was swept away by a tide of violence, and with him ended not only a dynasty, but an era.